How do I get good medical evidence? This is a question that actually came in through our Facebook page. It was a private message, and we don't have a lot of time to respond to it, but anything like this that kind of would relate to other people, I'll try and make a video about it. So clearly, medical evidence is going to be important at various stages of a homelessness application and just a housing register application as well, to be honest, particularly around priority need, but not just priority need. So it'll also come into play in intentionality potentially if for example you've got a mental health issue where your capacity fluctuates or something, and it would also come into effect, or it could become relevant with homelessness itself. So let's say, for example, you're in mold infested accommodation and it's having an impact on your asthma, for example, then that would potentially make you homeless. So again, medical evidence is going to be the thing that makes the difference then. But the thing to understand with this, and particularly with priority need, is these decisions, they need to be based on very detailed information. And what tends to happen with councils is what they will tend to do is simply write to the GP and ask for a patient summary, or all they'll get is a patient summary, which is really a couple of pages long, just gives a list of appointments you may or may not have attended, medication you might be on. If you're lucky, there might be a diagnosis on there, but not always. And ultimately, what's clear is that there is nowhere near enough information for untrained housing officers to actually use it effectively. So what that means is that if you can get detailed medical information, ideally before you actually make the application, and I'll come back to that in a minute, you are massively increasing the chances of you getting the help you should be getting. So, I've done various videos now on vulnerability, and I've talked about the Thomas test and the Smith test as kind of ways of framing the argument around vulnerability. And when I'm getting medical information for the clients I work doing my casework, I will literally ask, I'll use one or both of those 3-part tests just to kind of get the right information. So I'll use the Thomas test as an example. Does the patient have an identified existing issue? With that can include diagnoses. It could include things like old age or something like that as well. Number 2, would those issues be exacerbated by the threat of homelessness or by actually being homeless? And in many cases, let's say the answer to number 1 was yes, Joe Bloggs has got osteoarthritis. Number 2, yes, the pain and the mobility issues that come from arthritis are obviously going to get much worse if that person was homeless, if they're sleeping on the streets or something. And then 3, is there a risk of harm? Well, yep, the increased pain and the lack of mobility would obviously be an example of harm in that case. But bear in mind that obviously there's a huge range of medical, mental health and physical health issues that might come into play. And so asking your doctor those 3 questions is a good way to get them to kind of frame it well. As a bit of a tangent, I have had difficulty a couple of times with doctors who essentially are trying to downplay risk. Certainly when you've got like risk of suicide or something like that, if they write in their notes that they think that person's at real risk of suicide, then it means they've got a whole bunch of other work they've got to do. So I can think of one occasion for sure. I had a guy who was incredibly vulnerable. Every professional who's working with him was very concerned. And then we got a risk assessment back from the GP which said like low, and it was just like everyone was like, what the hell? So we ended up getting a psychiatrist to kind of trump that. And you can also get some GPs who I guess are a little bit suspicious of that process, and they're just very unhelpful in the information they give. I appreciate that in many areas you have to pay for these letters. I think we're just lucky in Bedford potentially, but almost all the time I've ever needed this medical information, I can ring up a GP surgery in the morning and say, look, blah blah blah, I'm working with this person, you're working with one of your patients, they're homeless. If I can get this information today, I can hopefully stop them being homeless tonight. If I do that in the morning, I'll often get a call back in the afternoon from the duty doctor, and I'll get a letter from them, often the same day, by 5 or 6 p.m. I'll have that letter to be able to send to the council. Now I know in some areas they'll charge 60 quid for it. And just as an aside, if you go to a council and they tell you to go and get a GP letter, that's unlawful. It's their job to get the information, not yours. But as I say, in the pragmatic world, in this situation, it's probably in your interest to get this medical information if you can, because you can basically make sure that the right information and enough information is actually provided to the council rather than just a patient summary. And I mentioned before about kind of getting in there early. If you have got the time to do this, and obviously you won't always, but ideally, if you can get this information before you make the application, that helps. Because often the best way to start an application is by, sending a medical letter with your application itself to say, look, here's my doctor, this is what they think. And if it's kind of tying in with that language and kind of talking about the risk of harm you would be at if you became homeless, then you've got a strong case basically. That's a good situation to be in. There's one other question I always ask doctors as well is, is whether the patient has a disability. And because I'm pretty sure not all doctors know the definition of disabilities, I spell it out for them. So I say, have they got an impairment which has a substantial impact on their day-to-day living activities for a long period of time, which is paraphrasing the actual definition itself. And that just kind of again just flags it up to the council, so that they should, as part of their inquiries, they should then, now that they're alert to the fact this person does have a disability, is they should be asking themselves, what reasonable adjustments do we need to make to our service to ensure that this person gets, an adequate service, basically. So as I say, it's always helpful to kind of throw that one in there as well. Now, you'll often have situations where councils will write to you and say, we've got our independent medical advisor to have a look at your case, and they say that you're not vulnerable, in effect. That's not quite how they say it. But basically, that's not unusual. There's one example of a company that does that. It's called Now Medical, and lots of councils use them, and they're basically, as far as I can tell, they're like a team of doctors. And crucially, they never speak to the patient. Certainly they don't routinely speak to the patient. They don't, see the patient. Often all the information they've got is just the patient summary itself, because that's all the council had in the first place. They've just merely sent it on to the medical advisor. And I've seen medical letters from Now Medical which are pretty appalling. Whether that was because Now Medical didn't do their job properly, or whether the council who referred the patient to them didn't do their job. Either way, we've got compensation claims based on those kind of really poor letters. But something to bear in mind with this is that if you've got a GP who knows you, who's seen you, who treats you, their opinion carries a lot more weight than just some random medical advisor who's never met you before. So if your GP is saying, yes, there is clear risk of harm to this person if they become homeless, and the medical advisor is saying, oh no, they'll be fine, your GP is the one, or your psychiatrist or your CPN or whatever is the one whose opinion actually matters. They should trump Now Medical advisors every day of the week. So that's just another thing to bear in mind just down that process. I don't think I have anything else to say about this, other than the fact that, if you can get detailed medical evidence, then you're making your life much easier. Because what happens, and some of the most difficult kind of cases I've been involved in, are where the person is vulnerable from day one. The housing officer doesn't really find that out, doesn't really kind of do the right inquiries. They reach a decision that they're not in priority need, and then they kind of get invested in that, so they end up kind of defending that non-priority decision. And they end up painting themselves into a corner, and often looking, I would be very embarrassed in some of these situations, to be honest, if I was a housing officer, but they kind of paint themselves into a corner, and they're just very reluctant to kind of admit that they were wrong. Whereas if you're going in from day one with the medical letter, from the start, then that can hopefully just alleviate that risk, because from day one they're thinking, oh, truth, this person's clearly involved, clearly in priority need. I'm not going to try and say that they're not, so it makes it a bit smoother.